Afternoon. Welcome to Drover's State of the Beef Industry webinar for 2023. We have two panelists that are going to help us talk about our subject, Neville Spear, an industry consultant from Bowling Green, Kentucky, and John Nalivka, who is president of Sterling Marketing in Vail, Oregon. So as part of Drover's 150th anniversary celebration, we sought to gauge producer attitudes, commitment, and management practices. And we were pleasantly surprised by the optimism and passion we discovered even after last year's historic drought. Our survey was conducted in April and May when there was still optimism the worst of the drought was behind us. It was for some, but many ranches in the Central Plains found out that the continuation of the drought would continue and affect their plans and their income for 2023. I'm going to start off with Neville Spear, and he's going to give us, deliver the State of the Industry survey. And Neville, I'll let you jump right in.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Greg. I appreciate this and excited about covering some of this. And I think just as you introduced all of this, you stated it really well, right? It's the passion and the optimism that came through. And actually, as I was reviewing some of this today, I was thinking also commitment, that there's clearly among many of the producers that responded a long run commitment to the business, and that comes through pretty clearly. I think also you noted really the key topic has been weather. I have a set of slides that I do for producer meetings, and I always start them off with that the weather was the story last year. And I think we sort of wanted to believe that was not going to be the case in 2023, but it certainly has been. Drought continues to affect the industry, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But I think it's interesting just to look through kind of what producers indicated they were doing because of the drought. And clearly, big chunk of them were able to kind of get through without many drastic actions, or realistically, many of them had to sell off some cows, and that becomes important. But I think the most important part as we look at this slide and producer responses is that even if we got quite a bit of good weather and started to get some rain, that restocking the cow herd was not going to happen in 2023. That producers were very clearly indicating that they were going to take their time, make sure that they kind of got a year under their belt before they did the all clear. And then really that makes sense for two reasons. One, as we noted in the industry report, hay supplies were record short. So producers needed to not only rebuild their pastures, but also rebuild their hay supply, right? They needed that buffer. And on top of that, it's not weather related, but we're in this very turbulent interest rate environment, and rebuilding a cow herd means that you're taking on added expenses, and that gets exponentially even more so when you've got interest rates and uncertainty around that. So anyway, let's move to the next slide as we talk about all of this. And I think it's important that can we go to the next slide? We're there we go. Yeah. I mentioned that right, passion and optimism, but also commitment. And really the results from our survey underscored all of that. And we asked the question, do you agree with this? Due to the drought, I seriously considered exiting the cattle business. And overwhelming majority of producers, the bulk of them, clearly indicated no, that's weather is as tough as it was. And we've had a long slog and 3 years of dry weather, and it's very challenging, not only in terms of outdoors and actually dealing with the elements, but I think it's also very challenging emotionally. Most producers, when you talk to them, it wears on you, and when it's just dry day after day after day, and there doesn't seem to be much hope. But it really underscores the commitment to the business. And I think as we've kind of come through some waves of ups and downs in the cattle cycles, and the longer we go, producers increasingly have staying power. And we're going to see kind of this core group kind of moving forward, and that probably dampens some ups and downs. But nevertheless, right, it really is about commitment here, and there's a number of other reasons that happens, but anyway, that's where we are. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So weather's been tough again this year, and I like to kind of monitor monthly cow slaughter, and I think Greg actually posted a column of mine up today that talks about that. But I did a column recently, and it was entitled "Higher for Longer," and what really dealing with cow slaughter through September, through October. We certainly we don't have final numbers from USDA yet, but they're certainly very consistent with what we've seen through the rest of the year. This is where we were in September, that we were projected to probably liquidate about 3% of the cow herd, and so, and that's as we kind of, or excuse me, at 12%, just a little over 1% every month. You can kind of just count on it. 10%, 9.5% would be roughly the break even. We start culling more cows than that, we're going to have a negative change in inventory. And if you kind of just go back and you put all those numbers together since 2000, or excuse me, back to 1990, with pretty good reliability, you can kind of predict next year's cow inventory. And at the end of September, kind of where we were in terms of slaughter rate, we're right around 28 million cows for starting inventory next year. That's probably changed a little bit through October. My most recent numbers have that at closer to 28.1, 28.2. The point being, whatever the number is, we've taken another pretty big hit out of the cow herd again this year. And so we just need to be mindful of that. And again, that's mostly because of weather. Okay, let's go ahead and go through to the next slide. And that really, all of that comes on top of the most recent cattle on feed report. And what's interesting about that is that I think we saw that placements were up in every single category, but most importantly, every quarter USDA provides us a breakout of the classes of animals on feed, steers versus heifers. And on October 1, 40% of the cattle on feed were heifers. And that's the highest number going back to 2001. And I think it's really a strong indication that producers have not yet turned the corner in terms of rebuilding the cow herd. We're selling cows and we are not retaining heifers, and they're in a wait and see mode. And again, much of that's due to weather, and then much of that is probably due to some of the uncertainty around interest rates and input costs. But that's really where we are. And any thoughts that was going to turn the corner in 2023 just has not happened. So, okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. With all that in mind, and some people could probably perceive that as being negative signal on the business, I think, as we talk about passion and optimism, the responses from producers were very clear, that they are either going to stay the same size or they're planning on ultimately growing. Very few number of producers said that they wanted to reduce their cow herd, and that's obviously forced by weather. But I thought what was really interesting was that a pretty big chunk of them said, we're going to actually have somebody come back into our business, and generally a family member. And that's, to me, very exciting. And it really matches what I'm seeing out in the country as I go out and do producer meetings. There's young people coming back into our business. And I really find that very exciting, and it underscores sort of that long-term optimism and commitment to this business, and we very clearly saw that through the survey. Okay, let's go on to the next one. I thought it was really exciting too, in terms of our producer responses of how serious they are about what's going on in our industry. And I thought as we sorted through these that we saw some very timely and meaningful responses in terms of what's really going on in the business. And producers agree that we're going to see increasing pressure to lower environmental impact, right? There isn't a day that goes by that we can't hear something about sustainability. And so more scrutiny on animal welfare. Obviously, we're going to have to do more in terms of higher quality carcasses and consumer demand and all of those things that make the business much more challenging than just producing a commodity cattle animal and selling them. It's much more nuanced. And so even despite all of those kind of external pressures that make the business more challenging, they're still willing to grow, willing to invest, and willing to be passionate and optimistic about it. And so I think it's a very telling kind of insight into where this business is going and the much more serious business-minded people that we have out there in a lot of what we do. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. Very interesting in terms of the use of LRPs. And when I go out and do producer meetings, I tell producers that this is one of the greatest things that the government has ever done for you. And you can't say that very often. But boy, we really were somewhat surprised by this in terms of the low number of producers that were participating in some kind of risk protection insurance. It's very easy as prices are good and, supplies get tighter and we get really bullish on this business. It's very, very easy to get complacent. But here's a program that to make sure that, some kind of external shock doesn't affect your business, because we never know what's coming, right? And I always like to say things that have never happened happen all the time. Well, LRP is really an incredible tool to prevent against any kind of external risk. And I highly encourage producers to look into this and certainly use it as a risk management tool. Okay, next slide, please. And this is just the big picture and a slide that really puts together lots of these things that we've already talked about. We were encouraged by the fact that, roughly 90% of our respondents had either been broke even or had been profitable. But most important really was the fact that nearly 2/3, they say they're optimistic about the future. And again, that's really underscores the commitment to the business. Very exciting about where we go. And again, that kind of combines with the fact that they're going to be bringing a family member back in and certainly looking to grow when we probably get some more favorable weather conditions out in the future. So with that, Greg, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Neville. Interesting stuff. I know we're going to come back and touch on some of the genetics information after we hear from John Nalivka, who is the president of Sterling Marketing in Vale, Oregon. And John, I'll let you have at it.
Okay, thank you, Greg. We can go to the first slide, Susan, the second slide. So as Neville was saying, the cattle inventory there's no growth in the inventory during 2023. I think there was simply too much. You come out of drought like we did in the previous 3 years, and you're not very inclined to start wanting to hold back heifers immediately and retaining heifers. The other part of it is the debt, and I think, as we all know, when you have an operating loan or a long-term loan, then the bank is there likely asking you to sell more heifers instead of holding them back and breeding them for building your herd, because you will not, obviously you're 2 years down the road before you see any income off that heifer, and you could sell her right now. So I've got the inventory down about 2.5–3% at the beginning of 2024, and then I've got it holding about even with that number in 25. We're kind of in this situation now where, we could go for, maybe another year, be end of 2026 and still have an inventory that's even to up only slightly. So that's kind of where we're at. Next slide. So the other part of this story on this cow herd, and that's the production and our productivity in this herd. And that, as you can see, the production, per cow, we were over 700 pounds of beef produced per cow this year, but it'll drop next year simply because we're going to bring our beef production down. I've got it down about 7% next year. So, but you can see is where we crossed that line in 1988, and the inventory continued to decline while the production continued to expand. And that has a lot to do also with the market with regard to prices, but it also says a lot about the industry as to how we got there and gained that efficiency. And a lot of it's just heavier. I mean, you could say heavier carcasses. They are bigger. I mean, we look at these carcasses today that weigh a steer carcass weighing 900 pounds, and it's not so terribly long ago that your carcasses were weighing 750 pounds or 700. Next slide. So my projection on the cow-calf operating margin, I've got it about roughly $450. This is an operating margin, and it doesn't take into account, there's no fixed debt paid off of this. It's just simply operating. And then I've got it in next year potentially going up to $500. My costs that I put into this model is I'm running it roughly around $850 to $900 to run a cow right now. So, and that will come down some, but we still have one of the primary costs in that is energy. And that's, you can see where the 1980 to 2022 average was at $95 per head margin. So we're considerably better than that now, obviously. And I would say I've built a model to do this, but a lot of the data that I put into this came from consulting I did on ranches back in as early as back in the 1980s, and then into the 1990s when I was doing a lot of business consulting with various ranches. Next slide, please. Yeah. So here's the operating cost, and again, we're up hovering over $800. Well, so the margins come up, but so is the operating cost, and it's from every perspective when you look at that. And it's one thing, and I kind of hit on a little bit here on another slide down as I go forward on this, but one thing about these cow-calf, these ranches, their economies of scale is extremely important. And if you're that long run average cost curve, it turns down and continues to decline until you get to about 500 head. So if you've got 100 cows, you're kind of likely on the high cost end of this operating cost curve. Next slide. Cow slaughter, again, as Neville was saying, U.S. beef cow slaughter, I've got it this year, will be down about 13% from last year. And then as we get into 2024, I've got beef, and I break it down between dairy and beef. I've got beef cow slaughter down 25% next year. If you're not retaining heifers and building the herd, then you're obviously not. You've got a fairly young productive herd. You've got fewer cows going to the packing plant. So we'll just see another pretty significant drop in beef cow slaughter next year, down 25%. Next slide. I think this is important in 2022 that we slaughtered 13% of the beef cow herd. I think Neville brought that up. That's the highest percentage since 1984. That's a lot of cows. And it's not just drought, it's economics. There's, making these ranches work with that, with particularly as we came into 2022 and 2023, these high grain prices, high hay prices were, out the roof. So it just was a high cost deal. And so obviously that led to this cow slaughter. Next slide. So here we sit in October, and the 5 to 6 weight steer calf price was 80% higher than the 5-year average, the 2016 to 20 average. So what do we do with that? Next slide. Production, I think it's really important to keep in mind that production efficiency and capacity are key drivers in the industry, and that's not going to change. And that's across the industry, whether you're talking about packing plants or feedlots. You gain significant economies of scale when you get bigger, and but you build capacity and you become more efficient. So those are drivers, and those are not going to go away. Next slide. So record high, this might sound kind of odd, but I do say record high prices are concerning to me. High prices pose a significant risk to the market and ultimately the financial well-being of the entire supply chain, everybody in that chain. So then managing that financial risk becomes imperative. Beef quality is the key driver to continuing to grow beef demand and will increasingly be data-driven. Packers will assess and adjust slaughter capacity from the perspective of all company-owned plants relative to value-added further processing capacity. We do not have a shortage of packing capacity in this country. In fact, right now, the fed guys are running these plants with these fed cattle, averaging somewhere in the low 80s, 83 to 85%. The cow plants are a little bit less than that. So it's not, so we don't need any more capacity, and utilization of that capacity is extremely important. I always say, and always use the example, you wouldn't buy, we talk about utilization in these packing plants or in a feedlot, same situation. You wouldn't buy a ranch and pay the value of a ranch that runs 500 cows and only run 100 head. It wouldn't work. You wouldn't buy a hotel that had 300 rooms and only fill 25 of those rooms every night. Utilization is a key issue in economics. Feedlots must continue to increasingly incorporate formula pricing with individual packers into their marketing plan. Right now, we're about roughly 75% of the cattle are sold on formula, and that's good. Ranchers must incorporate data-driven genetic merit into their marketing strategy. And I define that as simply nothing more than risk management, because you're producing the calf or the feeder animal that meets the market. I'll bring it up. I was recently asked to be on a national task force that looks into this particular issue, and it was driven by the Red Angus Association. They kind of started it, and then Tom Brink and Dr. Ken Odie were major players in this, in developing this. We had our first meeting last Thursday. The whole idea is we're going to investigate. There's about 40 of us on that task force, and we'll have meetings over the next 18 months. But the whole idea was to look into how can we capture that genetic value that you, the ranchers, are paying. You're buying good bulls, you're doing DNA testing, you're doing everything you need to do to capture greater value for that animal that will meet the market. You need to be paid for that. You can create value all day long, and if you don't capture that value in the marketplace, it doesn't really, it doesn't go very far. Next slide. So once I've said for years, once the package is off, quality and consistency are what differentiates the product that the consumer buys and will continue to buy. We have seen that. I mean, you could not have a better situation than we have with beef demand right now, and that is the result of quality and consistency. Next slide. This is just a slide showing the beef quality grade. We're currently grading. We've been running right around 85 to 86% on our choice grade, choice or higher, and you can see that's that's a pretty big jump from where we were in that 2009 to 2014 average at 73%. We've basically added nearly 15 percentage points onto that average. That's amazing, and that's what will continue to keep that consumer willing to come back and buy that beef product in the retail case, or buying it buying a steak at a restaurant. Next slide. Beef demand is a consumer's its willingness and ability to pay a price for a good or a service. Demand, in my way of thinking, is not uniform across the beef carcass. It varies across the carcass for each one of the cuts and the ground beef. And when you build those back together, the pricing on each one of those subprimals and that ground beef, you build that back together, you have what we call the cutout value. Next slide. So what does it take? An old friend of mine, Doc Hatfield, who started Oregon Country Beef back in 1986, and I helped him out. I was working at Cooperative Extension at Oregon State then, and I was helping Doc on his idea. He built Oregon Country Beef, and Doc always said,
John, you may have froze on us.
I've extended Doc's comment to also the right cattle for the right market. Find a program that fits you and your ranch, understanding your costs thoroughly. I could put that in capital letters on a screen and not put anything else. You've got to understand your costs, and the goal is to increase your net revenue, not just the top line. Revenue is revenue minus operating costs, and that's called cash flow. And positive cash flow will generate positive operating margins. Participation in and complying with the protocol for a branded program may increase costs. I've had people call me and say, gee whiz, I got into one of these branded programs, and at the end of the day, I didn't make any money. And I said, did you know what it was going to cost you to be in that program? And he goes, well, I never figured that out. I just figured it had a big, I was going to get $200 a head premium, and that's all that mattered. And I said, yeah, but you spent $300 to get there. And, you need to understand your costs, and you have to analyze your total ranching operation and the financial structure. And I'm just a firm believer in that. And we're to the point now in this industry, and this goes back to this genetic merit. You have to market your cattle, not sell them. So I think there's one more slide, maybe. This is my last slide, and it's all about that calf value you'll capture with genetics and management and marketing. You got to look at the overall big picture, and that's the carcass and the health and the growth ability of that calf. That's what will capture value, and what we're looking at on this task force with this genetic merit, because it's all those things. And when you maintain, when you build a database on your herd and capture that information, and you walk up to a buyer and say, here's what I have to sell, and it's all right here, then that's the difference of really capturing that value. That's all I have, Greg.
I have several questions that have come in, and I'm going to start with what you were just talking about, John. And I talked to a couple of feed yard managers prior to your genetic merit pricing task force last week, ahead of that for a story I was working on. So the feed yard told me they have customers that will pay more for those kind of cattle, but they're having trouble they're not having trouble finding preconditioned cattle. They're having trouble finding cattle that have been preconditioned and they know the genetics. That's what really makes them worth more. Correct? Is that what you heard at your meeting in Denver?
Yeah, and and there's there's quite a few variables and different factors that affect the value of those calves in the market, and even lot size. I mean, there's been they just recently did a study at South Dakota State, and they did one at Oklahoma State that we talked about, and it was pretty inclusive in these. They went to sale yards and they broke it down to how these different attributes of these calves that were sold through the sale yard. But lot size, mixed loads, all these things have an impact. And so you have to really think about when it's marketing cattle and not just putting them out there and hoping that somebody comes along. It's not difficult to get top dollar in today's market when we have a tight supply of cattle, but what's going to happen when that supply increases or demand gets a little bump in the road? And if you want to continue to get that value, then you have to start looking at you have to be data driven is probably the easy way to say it.
I'll ask this of you, Neville. In the future for this industry, is it going to be imperative that cow-calf producers be willing to mingle their calves with their neighbors?
I think that's a fantastic question. In fact, I wrote it down while John was talking, because he mentioned something about, economies of scale and size. And one of the things that I always tell producers, that you will never get the best price nor the best opportunity as long as you continue to be independent and anonymous. Right. And if you can choose to be independent and anonymous, but you are not going to maximize the value of your calf crop. So absolutely. I mean, and one of the best examples I know of is the Tennessee Beef Alliance, where those cattle get commingled and marketed together. And of course, bigger load lots, right? And they get like kinds put together, and it makes a significant difference.
And increasing or maximizing the revenue off of our calves does in fact help us remain independent, correct?
Well, yeah, certainly adds to stability. Yes. Yeah.
You
might have to work with your neighbor, right?
Yes. Well, that's what I was going to say, Neville. It may be worthwhile to go sit down with your neighbor and talk about this, instead of always looking over at his corral and saying, well, his cattle aren't as good as mine. Well, talk about it.
It's interesting. My wife's family, they run on a forest permit in a pool, and they all work together and they market their cattle together, and it's really helped them. Yeah. And it's challenging at times, and not everybody agrees with everything, but I would say they probably all would agree over the long run. It's certainly added value to their calf crop, and it's been worth it. Yeah. Hey, by the way, Greg, I want to come back to something John said.
Sure.
Because I think it is also the most important thing. And John, you were talking about costs. You have to know your costs. And I always tell producers, you need to get inside. This computer, as much as you may hate it, probably is going to return you more money than going out and doing something outside. And we like to be outside. We feel like there's return, but I always liken it, and I tell producers, you're in Shark Tank. You have to know your numbers. And John said something else too about debt. And bankers are going to be increasingly scrupulous about your finances. And you want the best opportunity in terms of your credit lines and what have you. And if you don't have your numbers and you don't know them, and you can't break them apart, they're not going to have much confidence in you, and you may not like the outcome. And it's just imperative to know your costs.
Well, and along that line now, you were talking in your survey, you found that people are more ranchers or cattlemen are going to bring their son back, and more often than not, they've been to college. Well, let them come back and use some of that college knowledge to build your database for you. you know, your cost analysis.
By the way, it's also amazing, and Greg, right? We've written about this in Drovers, is the Kansas Farm Management Association. Even within cow herds of similar size, the cost difference between high and low return producers is amazing.
Yeah.
And then you start multiplying that times 100 cows times 10 years. Boy, if you're a low profit, high cost producer, you're giving up a lot of money over time.
It was interesting, just as kind of a side note, I did my master's degree in Nevada 100 years ago down in Reno, Nevada. And it was actually a cost study of the entire Nevada ranching cattle industry. And I was comparing the cost on those desert operations with year-round grazing in central Nevada to the ranches in northern Nevada where they're feeding hay and you're up there in the winter in Elko County. And amazingly enough, and people said, well, I can tell you right now, it's going to come out those guys down there in central Nevada have a lower cost. Well, they have a lower cost, but then put it on a per unit basis. They're producing beef. Cost to produce a pound of beef was less in northern Nevada because they had more pounds. They were producing more pounds of beef, even though the cost was higher.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
So I have another question related to our industry survey, and there is no way to do an industry analysis this year without talking about beef on dairy, and we haven't touched on that yet. But the story that I did for that state of the beef industry was that this year we will produce 3 million beef on dairy calves. That's in comparison to 100,000 in 2013. Those numbers are approximate basically, but those animals, those beef on dairy cattle, are higher quality, provide greater feed efficiency, and they lower the environmental footprint of those animals and reduce GHG emissions. So go ahead.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I've had more than one conversation with clients about that very topic, and you start talking about it, discussing it, looking into it. It makes a lot of sense, and it was coming anyway. I mean, it's a lot better than just kicking those straight dairy calves into the market.
So the interesting thing, and I just picked up on this in what you were talking about, John, but we talked about working with your neighbor. So this beef on dairy segment is really the feed yards and the calf producers, the dairies that are producing these calves are actually working together and have their own program system going. They know where the cattle are headed when they're born. They know how long it's going to take to feed them. They know where they're going to be slaughtered. And from the packing side, they know they're going to get a better quality carcass than they were. And not that there aren't still some problems, but my genetics friends tell me that they're working on specific dairy beef semen for those dairy cows to maximize those qualities that we find are important.
Yeah.
All of those, and Greg, it's interesting, right? It's also a consistent supply year round. And for a feed yard, those are extended stay cattle, right? I don't have to go hustle up other cattle, and once I get them there and kind of get them straightened out, instead of kind of dealing with calves coming in the fall of the year, and it's in that way also a risk management tool, because what's the biggest challenge for a feed yard? Just like a packing plant, it's labor, right? So if I can have an extended stay steer and forego some of those health issues when they on arrival, I'm going to try to get those. Yeah.
This is going to be a broad question, and maybe we've already discussed parts of it, but what do you think this industry's greatest challenges are going forward as we, in the next 2, 3, 4 years, as we actually begin to restock this cow herd?
I think one of the biggest challenges, and of course, I live out here in where we have BLM and Forest Service, public lands grazing. I think the grazing, whether you're on federal land or you're on private land, I think all the environmental issues that go with grazing and raising cattle will continue to grow and be a bigger issue. And I think it's not insurmountable by any means. We all know that there's a huge list of positive aspects of raising cattle and producing cattle in this country. But I think it's a matter of, I think ranchers, and they're getting a lot better, but I think producers are simply going to have to get out and tell their story and say, this is what we do, this is how we do it, and this is why it's good. And it's not typically, people in agriculture aren't wanting to get out and jump out and say, hey, you need to know this. But it's one thing for the three of us to be telling the story, but it's another thing when the person who's actually out there doing it, telling the story. I always like to tell the story real quickly, but when we were branding up my father-in-law's ranch in his corral, which I didn't like it very well, but it was right next to the highway. But anyway, a guy stopped, and we were roping calves, and he said, can I watch? And my wife said, well, yeah, if you want, that's perfect. Well, by the time we got all said and done, we had him helping, working. And when he got done, he said, that was absolutely the best 2 hours I ever spent. He said, that was incredible. And he said, I wouldn't have known anything about this if I wouldn't have stopped and asked. So I think there's something to be said for it.
Greg, that's exactly where I was going to go. Same theme is it's the external pressures that are the challenge. And unfortunately, we spend a lot of time in our business infighting. That doesn't get us anywhere, right? The challenge is going to come from the outside.
Yeah.
Increasingly, these challenges are from people that are younger. I know when I started in this business, we talked about the people here in the suburbs of Kansas City. They were one generation away from the farm. They still had a grandpa on the farm. Now it's 2 and 3 generations away, and they don't have that, background whatsoever.
And anything negative can be reinforced so easily through social media.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so we really need to be very careful and deliberate about how we tell our story. And we need to be telling our story instead of fighting with each other.
Yep. I think
John,
just real quickly, Greg, I think what that really gets down to is thinking supply chain. We've got to get away from that gate at the end of the ranch, at the end of the road at the ranch is not the end of the road for you. You go well beyond that. You have to think that supply chain all the way through to and that animal is finally a nice, beautiful steak, ribeye steak sitting in a retail meat counter.
Yeah, and right, that's John. That's exactly right. And really, to that point, we have to remember we are in the consumer business.
Yep.
Right. We're not really in the cattle business. We're in a consumer business. They are the business, and without those dollars, those cattle are worth nothing. Yeah.
So
exactly right, John.
This leads me into my next question, and in some circles, this can be a controversial, but in your presentation, John, you talked about cow slaughter being down 15, 20%, maybe 24% next year. So isn't it a given that we will import more beef next year?
Our imports are already increasing, and that's just, I think we get a little, it's very, very easy when you start talking about trade and you want to land on the export side of the equation. And that export side of the equation has largely been driven by people Well, look how many people there are in China. They have to eat. We can sell a lot of beef to China. China shuts off. They will buy 1 week and not buy the next week. That's how and they'll go to Brazil. And Brazil's a huge competitor of ours in China. And if Brazil's not selling to China, that beef is going to come here. We need to accommodate that more and talk about what is that, how's that beef fit into our market, in the grind.
And I want to go there with you, Neville, and ask this imports, as we increase our imports, a lot of that, the majority of that is ground beef, right? Because
Absolutely.
we're a ground beef market, and we don't want to grind those chucks and roasts out of those fed cattle that are worth $185 a hundredweight right now, right?
Absolutely, right. I mean, the bulk of imports are lean trimmings to go with 50-50 trim from fed steer production.
Yeah.
And that's how we make hamburger. And we're either going to, if we didn't do that, we're either going to end up grinding chucks and rounds, or we're going to dig even deeper into the cow herd, right? And that's the equivalent of killing the golden goose, yeah. Right? We have a value-added product that the rest of the world wants. Why would we want to reduce that? So
right.
So that's how we say imports can actually increase the value of our U.S. herd.
Right. And I know there's critics out there, they hate that, but you know what? You take those imports away, all of a sudden that 50-50 trim is worth about half as much as it is today. And that's, you're going to take $60-70 out of value of a fed steer just right off the top.
Hey, Neville, needs to be half for some of my clients.
Right? Yeah. So
no, you're absolutely right, and I think that when you got, again, that's that perspective of the look at the entire industry and not just that one piece. And this fight over country of origin labeling is we can fight that all day long, but the bottom line is we use imported lean grinding beef in our ground beef production. We don't produce enough of it.
Yeah,
right. I have one more question, and we're going to wrap up with this. And I'm going to let both of you answer. But originally, John, you were talking about the capacity utilization of the packing plants. They're in the low 80s right now, and the cow plants are even less than that. If we have at least 7 beef plants under construction at the moment that could add, if they come online, 10% capacity to our total industry capacity. Now, that's not to say that they won't serve different markets or have different customers, or but give us your crystal ball, what you think is going to happen when any or all of these plants come online.
I think when you think of what those plants are being built in 2023 and 24 and even into early 25, the technology in those plants is totally different than, not totally, but largely different than the existing technology. They're new plants, and they'll be built to do things that we're not currently doing in some of these older plants. I think we're going to get rid of some of the old capacity as we bring some of this new capacity online. And I don't think that, and I know there's people who would say, well, the big four are going to get together in a room, they're going to figure that all out and decide. No, it's going to be decided individually by each one of those companies how they're going to manage that capacity. The margin in a packing plant is largely driven by value-added, further processed, branded products. And that can go all the way from a ground beef patty to patties all the way up to branded steaks, if you will. Well, that's the margin. So manage the capacity, the kill capacity relative to that, as opposed to just every day getting in the grind of trying to utilize that kill capacity. And that's a tough go. And I also think, given the labor situation, the Saturday kills will just simply become a thing of the past. I mean, that's where we're headed right now. So it's it's good. It's going to be better for the industry, I guess, is the long and short of what I'm trying to say.
I agree with everything John said. Just maybe a couple of things to add to that is it will be very interesting to watch. Ultimately, sort of the test of survival will be around working capital. And if as numbers get tight and margins get even tighter, who has the working capital to kind of outlast all of this, and that will be interesting. But I think John said something that's really important, and we've kind of touched around it several times today. But what's going to kind of shake out of all of this is we're going to increasingly see supply chain alignment, and I really think that's the theme of the next 5 years in this business, is that we are going to start seeing, and I'm already seeing this. There's money coming into our business to line up supply chains, and it will be very much a high value, quality driven type of system. Yeah,
and that's not a monopoly. It's not, it's simply like you said, Devil. It's coordinating all those pieces of the supply chain towards the same end.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is quality beef products, that consumers demand.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. This has been a great discussion. For all of our listeners, I want to remind them that if they want a copy of Drover's State of the Beef Industry Report, you can go to drovers.com and sign up for one. Until again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.